Welcome to the first ever class and Bain webinar on one of, I think, the more interesting topics that exist today, which is post-pandemic budgets, thinking, prioritization, and what that means. I'm grateful to have Eric here with me from Bain. I'll let him introduce himself in just a minute. But before I get to that, I wanted to give just a quick introduction to class. And the reality is, we've been around for 26 years. Most people know us for our best-in-class work, going out and measuring the success of the client with the vendor or consulting firm that they work with. But I don't think most people know that the original vision was sort of 6 people working out of their basements to keep the industry honest. And one of the strange things that happens was every conversation we had, people would say, well, Adam, can you tell me about the next thing that I need to know about? And I think the watershed moment was a moment when people started asking us early on about ambulatory EMRs. And I knew there were hundreds out there and that seemed almost an impossible thing to measure, but there was no way you could get around measuring the early Logician clients and Athena, eClinicalWorks, Epic, some of these folks that were early players there. So it certainly stretched us beyond any place we ever thought we would be. And as part of that, I will just say how we were introduced and how some of this work with Bain came to pass was actually because of a simple question. We at Class are very nerdy, I would say, on the world of healthcare technology and services. And we were, if we have a 400 slide deck, we see that as a badge of honor of how many cool things we've learned. And actually wanted to flip that around to go to ask Bain how to think about things in a more succinct way. How do you make the huge amount of data more impactful to actually change the market and change the industry. So that was the question that we led out to Bain, and that's led to some of this research that we're doing together today, which I think has been very energizing for our team, and I think brings together two worlds of deep insights and lots of data together to make something we think is fairly interesting today. So with that, Eric, let me turn it to you for you to introduce yourself.
Yeah, happy to. So my name's Eric Berger. I am a partner at Bain & Company. So we're one of the large strategy consulting firms and cover a broad range of healthcare and financial investors, private equity clients, all across the United States and globally. I spend my time working with a mix of private equity investors or growth equity investors, plus large health systems or payers that are evaluating all sorts of strategic questions. We've been thrilled to have the chance to partner with Adam and the entire Class team over the past year or two. It's really been a great opportunity for kind of a meeting of the minds, and kind of we've appreciated and enjoyed getting underneath the hood and seeing all the data that they've got. And I think the feeling is mutual. And so it's been one of those good examples of bringing the best of both of our firms and both of our sets of experience to try to shed some light on interesting market dynamics, interesting things going on in healthcare today, to have some good discussions with folks that are out there.
Well, thank you, Eric. Let me just introduce this research quickly, and then you can start to share some of the findings, and I'll give some color commentary from some of the interviews that Class has done as part of this. But the theory was that you would take the Class interviews and the deep research, the one-on-one interviews, tie that with Bain research and with the analysis that they do and the analysis from our teams, and see the so what's and then the therefore what's that come from data that feels like it's a pretty hairy, crazy world. You take inflation, you take staffing challenges, you take COVID, you throw on top of that a pending recession. I think it just makes it feel fairly schizophrenic when you start to talk to people out in the market. So Eric, we're hoping that you can help bring some clarity to that from what otherwise may feel a little bit helter-skelter.
Like Adam said, the context of our joint research was the following. We all were sitting around last spring, early summer, coming out of, everyone getting their second COVID shot, thinking about what the world was going to start to look like as theoretically things, started to level off and we all got back to work and had this aspiration of things going back to quote unquote normal. I think little did we know, the way inflation and some of the macro, uncertainties, whether it's geopolitical and otherwise, have continued to have an impact on the market. But really, the set of questions we were trying to answer over the past few months has been how did COVID and the overall set of macro uncertainties impact how providers, broadly defined, health systems, big, small, home health agencies, ambulatory, providers, et cetera, how did that impact their spend on technology, and whether or not people are spending more or spending less? Given what they are spending, what are providers prioritizing across their tech stack? So what elements of their tech stack are getting more or less investment? So as we were heading into September, October, as many of the large health systems think about their 2023 budgets, the question is really, is your budget going up or down, and what are you spending more or less money on? Not vendor specific, but kind of thematic area or at the budgeting level specific. And then the final question was like, are there ways to explain some of the observations we have? Meaning, how are the systems behaving? What kind of buying behavioral archetypes do we see? Can we get past the kind of, is the hospital big? Is it small? Is it rural? Is it urban? Kind of going beyond some of those more traditional characterization of providers to think about what specifically they're doing. So that was the context, and I'll take you through a couple of those key questions. Let's start with what shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone, but healthcare technology software remains a critical strategic priority for providers across, large health systems, regional health systems, freestanding hospitals, large physician groups, home health, and others. What you see here is either the bright red and the second red coming from the bottom up shows whether healthcare technology is a top or top 3 priority. And so you see almost half of the systems and half of the entities we interviewed said it is a top 3 priority. Nearly 80% would say it is a top 5 priority. This is at the C-suite or CEO level of what matters to you going forward. So healthcare technology is one of the most important strategic priorities for vendors, which just continues to emphasize its criticality to navigating some of the issues going forward. So then the question is, it is an important strategic priority. And what impact, if you look back over the past few years, did COVID-19 and kind of all of the other things that have been going on have, and how did that impact your investments? And what starts to become interesting here is you see a bifurcation or a split. You see roughly half, maybe a little more than half, about 55% with 5s or 4s. People who answered the question, we accelerated our spend on software technology investments in the midst of COVID. So even as we were pulling back spend on so many other things and dealing with all of the financial and operational challenges of COVID, we accelerated what we were doing on technology. And then you see, again, maybe it's not exactly the same amount, but it's, call it, 40% of the market or so said we slowed our spending down. So almost you would have interviews, and Adam can shed some light on this. You would ask the exact same question. And again, there are some nuances between whether or not they're urban and large or small and rural. But you would ask the exact same question and you would get literally night and day answers that were on, the opposite ends of the spectrum about what people were doing with their spend.
Yeah, if I could just chime in on that, I can remember a specific week where we were talking about this research and we just started it. And I'm on the phone with I'd say innovative children's hospital, but not large by any sense of the imagination, who was radically increasing their spend to do some very big things that they thought were going to change how their health system acted, how they were able to care for patients. And that was my first sort of stake in the ground of, okay, people that are ramping up their investment to speed through some of the challenges that we're facing today. And then I talked to the leader of a big for-profit health system who said, we have pulled every lever back. We've got the brakes on every train car on this train. And even as we get proposals back from our payers, it feels like they're shrinking reimbursement on nearly everything, as if we're in the middle of a recession versus we're in the middle of a huge inflationary period where we're paying just a ton for everything, including staffing. And it felt crazy that, okay, you have these two groups that are taking very different approaches. And I love that some of the research that happened here helped to pluck out how you can differentiate between the two. And I'll let you keep going on that to give how we think about it.
So now as we look forward, again, the kind of the forward-looking answer or question was, how is the current macro environment impacting where you're going, how much you're going to spend going forward? And again, we're seeing similar themes in that it was a roughly even split between those who say it's going to go up and those who say it's going to go down. You see some quotes and verbatims on the right, but again, you see people who say healthcare is different, it's just not going to be impacted in a recession, we're going to keep on plowing. And then you have others saying, look, we've already shaved our budgets, we are shrinking as best as we can, we're going to be renegotiating contracts, we're kind of battening down the hatches and going forward. But this kind of bifurcation of spend had less to do with COVID and the immediate after effects of COVID, and more to do with some of who the hospitals actually are, how they behave, what's their DNA. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I think both the backward looking and the forward looking views were both consistent.
And I was with I'll call a budget provider who said, look, we think 95% of our IT spend this next year is going to be for just basics and fundamentals. We're not out trying to do a lot of wild things, but we're going to try to catch up on some of the tech debt that we have, but just do very much the basics. And then from another health system who said, look, Adam, we used to have investments that covered a lot of sins that would help just tackle a lot that we need to. They said we made $1 billion in investments last year, and so far this year we've lost $1 billion. So if you can picture a $2 billion swing, it just almost blew my mind, just the fact that, okay, how do you deal with instability like that?
Well, good. So let me share a few more pieces of data. So we understand that half the providers are increasing spend, half of them are pulling back. So there's kind of a mix of what's going on. When we look at what are your top priorities, so thinking about your budget, where are you doubling down, and what are your priorities, whether or not your budget's growing or shrinking? What was interesting to us is this chart started to illuminate the places in the IT or the tech stack that are gaining momentum and or continue to have momentum. So some elements of this chart won't be surprising, but you see rev cycle and payments was the leading mention in the top five, and we gave them about 20 or 25 choices that span many kind of broad elements of a provider's tech stack. Not surprisingly, security and privacy is important. I think candidly that was a little bit more important in terms of the list of priorities than I was anticipating. But in the grand scheme of things, right, as we think about resilience and security and what providers are thinking about, particularly, to the negative, which is, look, one bad data breach or bad actor can ruin everything, no matter what we do on the upside. So the second one is, around cybersecurity and privacy is largely about playing defense. And then not surprisingly, we see things around, patient intake, flow, operations, their clinical systems, telehealth, and obviously lots of other things as we go down the stack. But again, top five priorities that were emerging were rev cycle and payments, cybersecurity and privacy, patient intake, operational flow, things related to efficiency, the underlying clinical systems, and kind of continuing to expand the rollout of telehealth capabilities.
So just a couple of things that I find interesting from this is it feels like the first bar just says, show me the money. Like I've got to figure out how to deal with the dollars that are coming in better. And so anything that ties to revenue cycle is a high interest today. And I know we'll talk about this in just a second, but also any new projects that are coming in, people are saying, what's the ROI on that? Where I was not hearing that a year ago, was not hearing ROI questions. Now that's much higher on the list. And on the security front, I was having breakfast with a CFO a few weeks ago who said, look, Adam, I was just in the board meeting. Security is a real threat, but how much money do we spend on this? Like, it is such a tough moment when we have tough budget times. It feels like you're just pouring money down a hole at some point on the security front. How much do we actually spend on this is a huge question. And then one of those things that was a little surprising to me was patient engagement was as far down the list as it is. It still has a reasonable number who have that at the top. But I think there's sort of a discouragement around the fact that we've tried a number of things. They don't seem to be coming together quite as well as we would have hoped. And one of the health systems that said to me, hey, this is our number one priority for next year is patient engagement, patient satisfaction, how do we engage digitally, all of those things. I just wonder how well they're actually pulling that off, because I just found out their two key executives over patient engagement just left the company. So it's funny where we have a goal to do that, but if it's not funded, if there's not real energizing things happening around it, that it's really tough to get the momentum around that. So I can see why that's sort of declining along the scale of interest.
So the next thing we started to probe on is, how do you think about, as a provider health system, or otherwise, how do you think about your organization with respect to the current vendor landscape? And, to put it bluntly, we picked up a lot of FOMO, fear of missing out. And so more than half of the providers we interviewed or spoke to said that they were very concerned about missing something new, and they were overwhelmed by the number of options or technology vendors that are out there. They are getting bombarded by emails, marketing, conferences, around the latest shiny new tech solution. And they largely, face the next thing in the darker red, which is they are very, very busy with their current tech stack to spend the sufficient amount of time to understand and then really triage where to spend time, where to spend money, and which vendor is going to be the one, that's most important. And so, that leads to, look, more than 3/4 of the CMIOs, or the technology buyers or influencers that are out there in health systems, feeling like they're missing out on something, and feeling like they're unable to keep up with the pace of innovation and the number of new solutions. And they're just really worried in some ways that they're not going to, be able to respond, or, get a question from their CEO, get a question from a board member about XYZ, and really have the answer on hand. And so there are a bunch of implications we'll talk about in a minute. But this whole notion of the ecosystem exploding, likely to everyone's benefit, is real, and we picked up on it.
Yeah, there's two conversations that come to mind as you mentioned this. One was with a CEO who, as I'm talking to them virtually, held up our best-in-class book and said, Adam, I've literally bought one of everything that's in here. Every one of your categories, we've made a purchase, and we're moving forward. And he said, Adam, what I need is, I have 400 vendors a week that text me, email me, send a physician to kind of nudge, they knock on my door, and there's no way I can possibly vet all of these, but I'm sure there's cool stuff in there that I'm missing. So I think you're exactly right. They know they need to go new directions. They know there are solutions out there that will help them with that, but there's just a tidal wave of new vendors out there. And classes started to measure 150 of those emerging tech vendors. And those are vendor names you haven't likely heard of. I'm thinking of Carrot Health, Atlas, Laudio, Avasure. Like, you just go down the list. It's not your Cerners and Epics and Nuances and these traditional players. The second thought is, many of these executives, especially in IT, are saying, look, I just need to know which ones will plug into my current EMR. So it's such a headache if I try to bring something in that doesn't tie to Cerner or Epic or Meditech, that I really need players that have been vetted on that integration front. So that, I think, ties to getting to a faster ROI, and just that I need to show me the money here to look at some of these new solutions.
So that leads into the next point, which is, as a result, providers are increasingly looking to trusted sources of information, for new, what's new and up and coming. So they look to their EMR, they look to existing vendors. They're trying to think about how to simplify and streamline their tech stack, even as they, think about expanding more broadly. So there's this dynamic of, I want to go to my trusted sources. I want to add and deal with some of that FOMO, but do so in a way that ultimately simplifies things rather than makes them more complicated or complex.
Although it almost makes you twitch there, Eric. They want to have more of these new creative solutions, and they want it to tie into their existing EMR, and it's a tough situation to be in to end up with both of those.
Exactly. So I think let me end with one more final page, which is as we look out, the last question we asked was how do we think about, what these different providers are doing and what are the thematic buying archetypes across these different provider groups? And one of the things we started to see was behavior often has a lot to do and preferences around how providers are thinking about their technology. And what we saw was kind of four different archetypes, is what I'll call it. So you have the kind of pioneers or the strategic thinkers. Those are the systems that are going to be the most active. They are willing to be early adopters. They are, willing to take risk on nascent offerings. You've got those who are fast followers. So they feel a lot like the pioneers, but they tend to be ones who are a little bit of the want a proof point. They want a reference case. They will be compelled by a good ROI and a good story, but they need something concrete to hang their hat on. Then you've got the value seekers and the budget buyers. These groups tend to be a little bit more tight on the purse strings, though they still may spend more money and make new investments. The value seekers tend to be those who are very, very focused on the 12-month or near in financial ROI story. So to convince these value seekers to buy, it is less the reference case from a trusted other health system in another market or another state who has said XYZ solution is incredible. These value seekers want to see the Excel, they want to see the ROI, they want to feel very comfortable that their investment is de-risked and they're going to make up their money in a relatively short amount of time. The last segment is the budget buyers. These tend to be, as the name would suggest, buyers who are very conscious of the overall cost. They may look for the lowest cost as opposed to the highest value. They're going to think about, market turbulence, as a reason to think about their spend, evaluate the entire, overall and really look at, putting a sharp eye to what the spend is.
So Eric, I think this is one of the most interesting slides in here is just how do you categorize and think about these buyers and these health systems as they're out there trying to move forward. There are several questions that have come from the audience that tie to these archetypes. So let me just throw out a few of them. The first one is this: do these pioneer organizations want detailed pro formas on their big strategic initiatives? Because they're the ones that are out trying the cool new things. What do you say to that?
I think the way we think about the ones who are trying cool new things is, there needs to be some element of innovation and some reason, a lot of times we think about, these people adopting, a 2.0 solution to replace a 1.0 solution, or something that they may find they have a technology solution today, but it's inadequate or likely not best in class. And so they feel compelled by this, by having the latest and greatest and by a software vendor that's willing to partner with them, who's willing to acknowledge that there may be bumps along the way, but they're strategic partners in this effort together, and they view them as such. And the trade-off is, we're willing to either, go on this journey together, but at the end of it, 12, 18, 24 months from now, our hope as a vendor of you is that you'd be a positive reference case for us to go, so that when we're talking to a fast follower, client, you're going to be the reference case for us.
Yeah, I think you're right. They're going to pay a lot less attention to the spreadsheets and a lot more attention to, is this going to change the market that we play in today? And I think of an example around people working on hospital at home. They know it's the right thing to do. They know the patients are going to ultimately be more comfortable there. Can they provide the care they need at a cost that's reasonable? So there are some pretty aggressive health systems working on that, and I don't think they're counting all the nickels and dimes today. While at the same time, the value seekers, if you go try to pitch them on a project like that, again, they're going to start twitching because they need to see the spreadsheet with the budget scenarios that they're in.
And in our experience, if you engage with, let's take the lens of a software vendor, if you engage with a sales force or a sales team, most of the time, sales folks, senior sales folks who are experienced, and they've got a roster of existing clients and prospects, can drop the names of who each client, of who their clients are in each of these buckets in like 5 minutes. And it starts to become quite illuminating because the buying behavior does not necessarily, there are some relationship, but not necessarily. It's not like all the academic medical centers fall into the pioneer category. It's not
Yep.
like all of the, for-profit versus non-for-profit fall into one of the others. There's this overlay of the people and the culture and the DNA of the system that actually can have a much more important impact on how they spend on software and what they spend on beyond just who they are.
Yeah. So let me just hit two other questions that tie to these archetypes. And one of those that came from the audience was this. It says, I've been part of organizations that have multiple personalities, in part reflecting environmental situations, opportunities, and pressures, and in part reflecting the personalities of various leaders. So have you seen this personality split phenomenon? Any thoughts on that, Eric?
Yeah, I mean, I think it largely has to do with um, the individuals, right? People are people, and people move around hospitals, and not everything is monolithic. And the finance team can have a very different set of perspectives than the strategy team and or the IT tech stack team, the tech team. And so, I think you see functional differences, you see individual differences, and what underlies some of that is obviously, their prior experience with any implementation or any tech model, but also their personal risk tolerance, right? Like the thing we hear over and over again with respect to trying out a new technology in a hospital or health system context is like, I'm not going to do something that's going to get me fired. And just I'm being a little facetious and extreme with that, but people are very risk averse, and or most people are, and so it's you need someone who's relatively secure in their professional trajectory, who's going to be willing to take political and technology risk in a health system, and assume it's going to go well.
And the only thing I would add to that is I think organizations tend to have a DNA and a culture generally, and they tend to attract then people that have more of that DNA and cultural way of thinking. So I think you do see a general DNA of a health system that may be more pioneer or maybe more risk averse. But then you're right. I was out at an organization that I think has some pioneering blood in them. But if you look at their finance and revenue cycle team, all of their tools they have are 30 plus years old. They're super happy that it just runs and they don't have to think about it. They're not even pondering the next generation of solutions that are out there. So even within a health system that has some DNA that moves towards creativity and pioneering, you have a department that's led by someone who's saying, look, let's be very safe on this today. And let me ask the last question here for today. And that, again, it's about these archetypes and it's about the budget buyers. And the question is this: are there any budget buyers who have been successful both in terms of finances and quality and outcomes? So I think they're trying to say, look, can I be a budget buyer and
Yeah.
still win at this game?
I think, I can't think of, specific logos. I would say yes. I would say you can be very disciplined in your approach to cost and spend, and try to essentially, win on other dimensions, right? I would say it's likely hard. I can't imagine an easy path to winning on patient loyalty, on clinician experience, lowering turnover rate, things if your tech stack is really bare bones. And so I think there's a difference between being really cost conscious and disciplined and being cheap. And so I think I want to make a clear distinction. I think, yes, it's hard to win in a market if you're cheap, right? And you're just not going to spend money on things that are required. Can you win in a market or in a business where you're highly disciplined and making certain trade-offs because you want to invest, you're investing behind another initiative or another pillar, because your belief is in your market or your specific circumstances, that's how you win and drive share. I certainly think that's a plausible possibility.
Yeah. And I can think of one hospital specifically that I've been to a couple of times that really has a budget mentality in terms of how many dollars they spend, but they have a really unique approach to each of these vendors where they try to partner. And partnering looks like, hey, we will come speak at an event for you. Let's try something new and creative that maybe we'll be the first to try and prove this out. So they use their creativity and flexibility to do a lot of things, to drive relationships, to be leaders out in the market, even though in terms of their actual spend, I'd say they're likely a budget buyer in terms of the dollars they spend. So I think they can do that, but I think you're right. There's definitely a difference between disciplined and just cheap. We're just not going to spend. And we see a number of those sites in trouble, and many of them have been acquired now in those kinds of scenarios. So with that, I would just like to say thank you to Eric for the thoughtful discussion today. I can't wait for the second annual one of these late next year of what's happened, what does the recession look like, how are budgets and priorities shifting. But until then, just thank you to those folks listening in, and thanks for the opportunity to share these insights today.
Thanks, Adam. Feelings mutual. We really appreciate it as well, and look forward to keeping the conversation going.
Okay. Thanks, Eric. Take care, everyone.